Welcome back, everybody, to the A Little Less Fear podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lino Martinez. Today, I'm very happy to introduce our guest. Her name is Lisa Sugarman. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Hey, I'm so happy to be here, Lino. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Today's topic is going to be on suicide prevention. It's a very touchy subject for a lot of people. For me, it used to be a really touchy subject because I have an uncle that was my father's first cousin, actually his cousin who taught him how to speak English and stuff, committed suicide in his 30s. He was early 30s. And to me, it was always a mystery. I wrote about it in my book too. If anybody's curious about it, A Little Less Fear, also the same name that I have as my podcast, it's all available on Amazon. But I wrote about suicide because it was such a mystery to me. Once my uncle committed suicide, it's like nobody really talked about it afterwards. It was like, yeah, he left a letter. What did it say? I don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody will ever know. And all I know is that he was handsome and he was funny. He was a life of a party. And then all of a sudden he was gone. And and
I'm
then
so sorry.
actually when that happened, I was 13 years old. And I remember it being such a nonchalant subject, like, oh, suicide, yeah, it's there, and it is what it is. And it kind of followed me. And when I started to go through depression, trying to identify with who I was and stuff that I was going through with my health, and I really didn't have any answers. To me, the only answer at the time when I was in a lot of pain and stress was suicide. So I had a suicide attempt when I was about 21, 22 years old, and it landed me in a 5150. And it actually, to me, it saved my life trying to have a suicide attempt, because I, being in the 5150, I met a lot of people that were trying to commit suicide as well. And most of those people were elderly people. And it broke my heart seeing these people that were 70 and above in the same facility that I was. And I was asking them questions, what made you want to commit suicide? And this one story specifically, this he was quite a character. I'll just call him I'll call him Henry. I don't remember his name, but we'll say Henry. Henry was in his 90s and he had slit his wrist twice and he had stitches, and he was in a wheelchair. And I remember one time at lunch, during our little lunch break that we had, I asked Henry, what happened? Why are you here? And he, quit quivering, his old man with his sagging eyes. And he's telling me that he tried to commit suicide. And I said, well, why? And I remember at that point, at that moment, I was so involved into why I wanted to know his story that I forgot why I was there. And
Yeah,
I was,
yeah.
yeah, and I was talking to Henry. He said, well, I lost my son, I lost my wife, I lost everything I had. I used to be a millionaire. He goes, I'm in a wheelchair now. He goes, tell me, what's my reason for living? I've tried everything. And I had no answer for him. I sat there and
Yeah.
I just stared at and looked at his sagging eyes, his blue eyes that were almost gray at that moment now, and at that time. And I was looking at him and I was like, well, you got to do things you haven't done. And he's like, well, I'm done everything. And I was like, and so I started naming things. Have you done this? He goes, yep, this. And I was like, what about art? And he goes, I've never been a good artist. And I was like, well, guess what? I'm not a good artist. So let's not be good artists together. So I pulled out this poster and we both started coloring. And he goes, well, what should we draw? And I was like, an hourglass. So we were drawing hourglasses. And in the middle of the drawing, he asked me, well, why are you here? And that's when I stopped. And I was like, oh my goodness, I have the same answer. But here I am, 21 years old. Like, what this,
Yeah.
I felt ridiculous at that moment. And then I was like, well, Henry, I try to take my life too. And he gave me the saddest eyes. His eyes already look sad. Now he really looked deep into my soul. And I looked down in shame. And then he just says, why are you doing this? He's like, you have your whole life ahead of you. And I just remember thinking, and I had a knot in my throat, and I was like, I got to change my life. And it was that night that I started writing, because I'm a writer, and I started writing a lot of poetry. And I started realizing, I was like, well, what am I doing with my life? And I'm getting my master's degree. I'm not happy here. Let's change my life. And I remember seeing a lot of psychiatrists while I was in the 5150. And these psychiatrists, I was like, what are they doing? They're just coming to talk to me, and they're doctors. I can do that. So I started right away. I was like, well, I'm going to change my profession. I'm going to be a psychologist. I'm going to get my doctorate in psychology. And that's exactly what I did. So to me, actually, a suicide attempt saved my life. And it took me on the journey that I am today, that I'm on today, which is helping people. And I'm not doing psychology one-on-one because I personally don't feel comfortable charging people for therapy. I feel
Yeah.
that it should be free, and it's not free, and it can be very expensive. And some people, and sometimes it's $200 out of pocket. That's crazy. So I give my information for free as a podcast, and I love it because we all get together and we all get to shine bright together and keep on living. And that's just my motto: keep on living, keep on going. But not everybody has this story, and getting here. And I'm sorry, I know this interview is we're gonna get to your interview, but I have a
No,
lot to
no, no,
share
no.
when
Then
it
you
comes
take
to suicide.
yeah, take your time, share away.
So when I was getting my master's degree, I was working at a rehab, at a dual diagnosis rehab, and I was seeing a lot of patients there. And within the 5 years that I was working there, I seen patients 3 times a week. For some of them that were there for like 6 months because they've got dual diagnosis problems with addiction and stuff. 5 patients out of the times that I was there committed suicide, and it was depressing me. And I started to feel like I don't want to do this because I'm not feeling like I'm making a difference. What can I do to make a difference? There's a lot of energy that's sparking inside me, and I need to share my passion and people that feel the same way. And so here I am coming across you, which is not by coincidence. Nothing is a coincidence. We are all on each other's paths for a reason, and it's here to lift each other up and to help us. And here you are
Amen.
saying that you're passionate about suicide. So welcome, and thank you so much for being open to talk about such a sensitive subject.
Yeah, of course, of course.
So tell our
At the same
listeners.
well, at the same time that I'm obviously sorry that you had those experiences, like you said, those experiences unlocked something, put you on a different path, brought you to where you are now. And that's such a powerful experience. And it's because of the power of that experience that you're so driven now to reach to other people and to impact other people. And I had my own watershed moment in my own life. And I know you and I were chatting a little bit before we started recording. And I mean, by trade, I'm also a writer. I write parenting books. I write a syndicated column called "It Is What It Is." That's just about kind of work-life balance and for sure family and everything from fitness to our mental health. But I'm also on the radio and I do all these different things, and I, like you, was kind of tracking in one direction for many, many years, doing all these things that all kind of jive together under the big umbrella of parenting and making families happy. And I had an experience. So I lost my dad, like you and I were chatting about earlier. I lost my dad when I was 10 years old. I'm an only child. I was incredibly close with my dad. He was by far and away my person. Not that I'm not close with my mom, because I'm incredibly close with my mother, but at that time my dad was my guy. We did everything together. And he was extremely successful. He was incredibly kind and generous and charismatic and outgoing, and just a brilliant man and a beautiful person, the kind of person that you took a look at him or you heard his voice and he just filled you up and he made
Nice.
you comfortable, and you just knew that you were talking to a good soul. And so very suddenly, when he was 45 and I was, as I said, I was 10, my dad passed away. And what I was told at that time is that my dad had had a heart attack. And then a 10-year-old kid, like, why in the world would I ever have any reason whatsoever to dispute that or not to believe that? So I kind of went through my life, and there was nothing that I could point to contradict that. It wasn't like he was having depressive episodes or he had was hospitalized, or there was nothing. So I took it at face value. It was what it was, and that's kind of the narrative that I had my entire life until I was in my mid 40s, when it's a really long story, but the gist of it is I bumped into a family member who I hadn't seen for a while, and she asked me about our kids. I have a 21 and a 24-year-old daughter, both daughters, and the conversation went from just being very innocuous, like, hey, what's going on? Let's catch up, to all of a sudden her asking me if my children had the same mental illness that my father had. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, what mental illness?
Mhm.
Because it was nothing that was ever discussed. It was nothing I was ever aware of. And so it just kind of sat with me. And ultimately I ended up having a conversation with my mom, who is very much now my person. And I got to tell you, it was the craziest conversation I've ever had in my life. I don't understand why I immediately jumped to the conclusion of suicide, because my cousin didn't say anything about it. She just said depression. And so in this conversation that I had with my mother, without even realizing where the question was coming from before it was out of my mouth, I didn't know where it originated. And I asked her if he had been depressed. She said yes. And the next thing I know, I'm hearing myself ask her if he had taken his life, and she said yes, and wasn't going to tell me because I was 10 years old,
Hmm.
and I was already shattered. My dad was gone,
Right.
and at that time, I mean, my mother is an incredibly progressive and open human being who was way ahead of her time with a lot of the things that she did, and in the best of ways. And but at that point, she was like, I can't put this on my 10-year-old kid because I don't know what it's going to do to her. It's bad enough she just lost her dad. So she told me he had a heart attack. That's what the belief was with among everybody in my family. And I became a young adult, and she was like, I'm not going to tell her now. She's going to high school, she's going to college, and then she's getting married. And
Hmm.
now I'm fully involved in my life. And
So
what's
these
the
are
point?
you asked her why didn't you tell me, and then she started
I
explaining to you why, or
Yeah, I mean, and it wasn't even me asking her, like, why didn't you tell me? I've never once had
mm,
a single moment's worth of anger or frustration or disappointment in the fact that she chose to keep that from me, because I completely
yeah,
understand
especially
why
being a
she did
mother
it.
of two. Yeah.
Yeah, mother of two daughters, and I mean, I was 10 years old, and I mean, my life just imploded when my father died, and that would have, I don't know if I could have handled it. I really don't know what that would have done to me if I had known at that time that he had taken his life. So she made the call. It was a game time decision, and I actually now, then and now, am just nothing but grateful that she
Grateful.
kind of took that hit from me. And she was completely honest, and she said all the things that I just said to you about, this was where you were in your life, and I didn't want to lay that on you. And then you were here and there, and at all these different stages, and I didn't want to dump that on you. And um, but finding out was, it sounds so strange to say it, but I think you'll probably understand. It was such a gift to find that out, because there were things about myself, the way that I'm wired emotionally. Like, it's always
Mm.
been a big joke. My husband and I have this big joke about my emotional wiring is like super exposed. Like, you know how wires have that little coating?
Yeah.
Mine have zero. So I like feel all the vibrations,
Oh
the
wow.
good and the bad, all the time. Always
Super
have.
empath, huh?
I was just about to say, she took it out of my mouth. I have always been a very, very, um, very passionate empath. And I, you know, I just understood that I had a kind of a different um,
Wiring.
emotional makeup, yeah, than most people did. And I wondered about it. I was curious about it. I at times was very concerned about it, because it's heavy. It's
Mm.
heavy shit when
Yeah.
you're
It really is.
always so affected by everything.
Mhm.
So it really kind of helped me to understand, the, kind of how the genetic cocktail mixed up maybe a little bit inside me. And that maybe I wasn't where my father was. I had never been suicidal. I've definitely had bouts of, um, of a form of depression. I know I have at different points in my life. But it clarified things for me. And, um,
What made you ask
and
the question about
I have
he
no
took his life?
idea.
It just came out?
I have no idea. It is the single strangest experience that I've had as an adult. I don't know what motivated me to ask. It wasn't like the conversation was going in that direction. It was just, honestly, I think my dad put a hand down from somewhere and said,
Yeah,
"Today's the day,"
probably. Mhm.
and just said, "This needs to come out, and you two need to work through it together." And
Mhm.
I mean, it's been a hell of a journey. I mean, our girls were in high school at the time, and um, both have had definite issues with anxiety and or depression, and both been very active um, in their own work on themselves um, to navigate that. And so I finally, when I got to a point where because I re-grieved my dad's death from day one all over again through a completely different lens. And after I had done that, I would cry myself to sleep for 3 years, and my husband, Dave, and my mom were the only ones that knew, and my kids had no idea, and finally I was like, "Okay, like, I'm at this point now where I've reconciled, I've forgiven, I've moved past, I have this understanding that it was an illness." And that was the thing, like, there was a big piece here that I haven't even shared with you yet, that I really had to overcome, and that was my own internal belief, and it was just my own, that suicide was so selfish. Just, I had a cousin who took his life when I was very young. It was like 2 years before my father passed away, so it was in the mid to late 70s, and like, it was just, it always felt like a very selfish thing to me, and it wasn't until I found out about my dad and really started to read everything and watch everything and listen to everything that I could about mental health and suicide prevention and awareness, and kind of the mindset that someone is in, and the fact that it's an illness. It's an illness like
Mhm.
like a heart condition, or like cancer, or like,
Right.
and it
Definitely.
needs to be treated in the same way. And that was a that was a watershed moment for me. That like put all the pieces together and allowed me, once I kind of reconciled with that, like, it just put me in a completely different lane, and I understood that, we all need to be sharing our stories. Like, you do what you do for the purpose of connecting people together through our shared experiences. That's what I'm doing
Correct.
now. And so I've pivoted everything that I'm doing. I mean, I've been writing parenting books for years, and now I'm pivoting everything, and writing this story about my father, in the hopes that it will resonate with just one person, just
Oh
one.
yeah, I'm sure it's more
You
than
know,
one. Absolutely.
I hope so.
And so, how are you? What else are you doing? You're doing radio. I mean, how are you speaking up about suicide prevention?
I mean, I've been on a lot of podcasts lately, similar to this. I've been involved with some groups, helping to co-moderate on Clubhouse. I've been invited to talk in some groups about my own experience. Um, I've been writing about it on my own social platforms, and I also had just recently was I connected with the Trevor Project, which I think
Oh,
you
excellent. Yes.
probably know.
Congratulations. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
thank you. I'm so excited to be involved with them, um, to help them in their mission of providing services and support and resources for at-risk LGBTQ teens and young adults. So it kind of marries together
It does
everything,
actually.
because
The
I'm,
highest suicide right now rates are in the LGBTQIA community.
yep, yep, they're 3 times more likely to make an attempt. So, and, and I have kind of a unique vantage point into all of this, or entry point, I guess, into that in particular, which is why Trevor Project was so important to me, because they obviously focus on LGBTQ youth, and not just suicide prevention, but crisis intervention. But I also came out, as you and I were talking about off the air. I came out as pansexual. I'm 53. I came out at the age of 52 as pansexual, and my oldest is bi. And so now I've moved from that position of being an ally of the queer community to being a member of the queer community. And I have 2 children in that age bracket. And one of them is queer, and I want to be there to support her and her peers as much as I possibly can. So now my own personal goal and mission is to just start conversations, have conversations, share my own story, encourage people to share theirs, so that we can draw strength from those experiences that we can all relate to and identify with, that might trigger something in us. I might hear something that you're talking about, and I'm going through it, and it's because you're talking about it, it resonates with me, and it puts me on a different path in a good way. It puts
Right.
me in a better place, or it makes me feel less alone or more supported. So
Yeah,
that's kind of where I'm at right now.
that's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
how do we prevent suicide? I recently on Twitter I saw this article. This was like a couple weeks ago, where this 13-year-old boy was being bullied, and apparently he didn't put up a fight, and he came home one day with a black eye, beat up, and 2 days later, his sisters found him hung in his closet, and he was
Gosh.
13 years old, and he looks younger. I mean, in the picture, he looks like a 9-year-old, and it just breaks my heart. I mean, it doesn't matter who it is or whatever, but just how do parents even prevent that? I mean, your son comes, he's being bullied, and it's like you really you don't know what's going on in his mind, and why would he choose, or why would anyone choose to just end their life for being
Yeah.
bullied? I really don't know. Nobody knows. I don't know. I just know that it's super duper heartbreaking, especially for the family to find their little boy like that. And my heart goes to all of them. And I just wonder, how do we prevent this stuff?
I think it's just a completely team oriented effort. It's parents working with teachers, working with mental health professionals, working with friends, where it's like a whole community effort. I think it all starts with destigmatizing everything that has become so taboo and so toxic. I think we open the lines of communication as wide as we possibly can between all of the people within our community
Mm.
who are in the case of parents and children, who our children are connected with. And we have these conversations and we're open about them, and we encourage our kids as they get older. It gets more challenging. I mean, everything from sexual orientation and gender identity, and um it all becomes super overwhelming, and you layer things like social media on there, and you layer things like
It's a lot
social
tougher
emotional growth, and
nowadays.
it's like a field of landmines. You send them out the door every day, and it's
Right.
like,
It really is.
I think, yeah, and I think we start by being as open and as transparent as we can, and having these age appropriate conversations with our kids, and letting our kids know that, like, we get it. There's some big, bad, ugly shit out there in the world, and there are some people out there who are going to try and tear you down. You have the power to prevent that, and we're here for you, and this pocket of people is here for you, and these resources are here for you. So I think it's a matter of, I mean, this is just my own opinion, I think it's a matter of just understanding, looking for, and then utilizing the tools and resources, and leaning into the people around you who can offer support to create kind of, I guess, maybe a safety net, and just paying attention.
Right.
Like, paying attention, like, don't I talk about this a lot, actually, when I kind of have the parenting hat on. We don't often listen to our kids. We're the ones doing all the talking, especially our kids who are within that cohort, who are most at risk, like, the 13, 14 to early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do a lot of listening. We do a lot of talking at our kids. So we
Mm-hmm.
we don't necessarily give them the bandwidth to really open up and let us know, what's frightening them, or what's challenging them, or what's upsetting them. So I think those are the places that we start, and then we just weave a net that we hope will be able to catch them before they hit the ground. You know.
That's true. It's so true. Parents need to start listening rather than talking, and that's because, I mean, I'm assuming, I'm not a parent, but I have two cats. I don't know if that counts.
Yeah, you're a cat dad, so it totally counts.
But when I had my suicide attempt and my parents went to visit me in the hospital, I remember writing about this, and it's also in my book, where they never asked me what brought you to this point. They just visited me, kept it quiet, and that was it. It was like,
Yeah.
and that made me more angry. It was like, well, don't you want to know what brought me to want to take my life? Like, come on. But people don't want to touch that subject. And it's like, it's a very human connection to make, and a very loving connection to make with your fellow peers, let alone your kids and friends, family, whatever. What brought you to this? Why are you feeling to that to that capacity? And this is very, I think it's really important. But you mentioned something age appropriate. When would it be age appropriate to bring up even that word suicide? That, let's say you have a kid that you notice that they're teeter-tottering with depression, and it's like, do you say, hey, do you ever have thoughts of taking your life? It's almost scary to ask, because what if they don't have those thoughts, and then all of a sudden you're
Yeah.
planning thoughts? So it's
Yeah,
like,
I
well,
know. Well,
yeah.
here's the thing. I mean, I'm not I'm not a therapist. I don't have those credentials after my name. So, this is all, a mom talking as a mom who has raised kids, who has had those
Those are
conversations with
mom
my
credentials,
kids.
more credentials than
Right,
I have.
right. I do. Sometimes I think mom credentials might well be the end all be all as far
Yeah.
as credentials go. That's just my
Right.
my own personal feeling. But there are ways to kind of ease into that conversation, like without necessarily using the word, which I know can be a really jarring word. The one thing that has been proven, and I don't know what the statistic would be off the top of my head, but I do know that it has been proven that by asking someone if they're contemplating suicide or having suicidal ideations, you're not going to cause that person to take their life. You aren't.
Mhm.
That is just something that is just a well-known and understood fact within the mental health community. If anything, it will kind of have the reverse effect, or could have the reverse effect, and allow that person to feel like there's someone there. Like, you only need one person. Like, I think the statistic of someone in the young adult age bracket who is contemplating suicide is 30% less likely to execute on that suicidal tendency or action with only one person engaging with them. By one single human being talking to them, reaching out to them, acting as a support, holding space, you
Mhm.
reduce the risk of that person, that young adult, taking their life by, I believe it's 30%. So,
Wow.
I mean, it's
That's how
it's
lonely people
powerful.
are. The ones that do.
Yeah.
That's how lonely they are.
Yep. Yep. A lot of people just really don't have an outlet. They don't have a safe space to communicate, and they're confused. And whether it's about sexuality, or it's about mental health challenges, whatever it is that's causing someone to have those dark thoughts, um, it's definitely not going to be harmful to have someone who is there willing to hold that space. If
Mhm.
anything, that's why you have crisis counselors. If anything, that's a lifeline. That's
Mhm.
someone who can listen and be, non-judgmental, who can hear you and understand you. And in some cases, even because a lot of crisis counselors have a lot of personal experience to bring to their counseling, you
Mhm.
can relate and identify with and have conversations with someone who now knows, like, oh no, I was that kid, or I get
Mhm.
it. I
Right.
understand how you feel. So, I mean, to go back to your question, I think it depends on the parent and the child and the maturity of the child and the
Very true.
situation. Like, there's so many different factors, but I think that, um, if you're old enough, if your child's old enough for you to have a conversation with them about them being bullied, or them being
Mhm. Right.
somehow torn down, or being anxious or feeling depressed, then you definitely can have a conversation about, like, well, how is that making you feel? Like,
Yeah.
and let them, kind of some prompting questions, which might help you siphon through what they're feeling to get to that answer. Like,
Right.
yes, they are having those thoughts, or maybe no, they're not having those thoughts. I mean, in a lot of cases, I certainly, if you've got kids in junior high or high school age, I would say absolutely could have those conversations with those kids.
Oh yeah,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, I mean,
Definitely
your
high
younger
school.
kids, yeah, like younger kids than that, I think, might require maybe a little bit more intervention, maybe a therapist or a counselor getting involved, to work with that, child who may not know how to articulate what they're saying, or what maybe can't get their mind around the idea of
Right.
suicide at that age. It's just so abstract. So, I think it's a case by case, but I think the most important thing, regardless of the age or when you start having conversations, is that you have conversations. You have
Absolutely.
some kind of conversation, and that's the thing. It's like, we've got to be, it's like that umbilical cord analogy. Everybody always jokes like, oh, my umbilical cord never got cut, I was so close to my kids. But like, we have to have our pulse on our kids and have to ask the questions, and not be afraid to hear the answers, because I gotta be honest with you, like, you're gonna hear some stuff you don't want to hear
Oh, I'm
at some
sure.
point along the way. And we just have to be open and patient and receptive, and and
Non-judgmental.
kind of non-judgmental, and ready to to do whatever it is that maybe our child needs us to do. I mean, that's part of the job,
What
you
about
know.
adults? So, I mean, like right now you're telling me about your father, he was 45. And then I think about Anthony Bourdain and his daughter was like 8, I believe, or something like that. And then I think about
Yeah.
Robin Williams, and all these incredible creative geniuses that are gone. And I think like these were super happy people traveling the world and doing good stuff. It's like, well, how do you reach out to these people that seem like everything's great? It's like it almost seems like, how would anyone really know? Some people really lock that stuff up and really don't tell anybody.
Yeah, they do. I mean, my father's a perfect example of that. I mean, my dad, from what I understand, my dad ultimately did end up seeing a psychiatrist. I think my mom said it was maybe a couple of months, 2 or 3 months at the most, before he passed away. But I think obviously it was too little, too late. And it was also, we're talking, 40 some odd years ago.
Mhm.
So that was a long, long time ago, 43
Right.
years ago. So I
And
mean,
even
things
back
were
then,
very,
I
very,
can imagine that was even more taboo to talk about back then. Probably less
oh, yeah.
modalities to help people about that stuff.
Yeah, far fewer. And and you put you layer the stigma on top of that, and the fact that it was just so underground that there was such a shame factor associated with it. And my dad's family um had a tremendous amount, had and still has a tremendous amount of mental illness, like serious mental illness in their kind of genetic pool. And a
Mhm.
lot of it didn't really come out. I wasn't made aware of it until after my father passed away, and decades later. And it was ironic that we used to think that my dad was so different than everyone else in his family. He was kind of that bright light that was so different, and so loving and open, and driven and charming. And who knew, he was ultimately the one that was suffering the most. I mean, I know what you're saying about the Robin Williams of the world. And we actually had a really really painful loss. One of my oldest friends in the world, mine and my husband, we've almost been friends, all of us, is just as long. I mean, he and I have been friends since we were about 5 or 6 years old. And he took his life. It'll be a year next month.
Wow.
Very, 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 very suddenly. Left a wife and two daughters in college. And no one, until the very, very end, no one really saw any signs of anything. And that you're right in saying that that's so scary, because I'm like, how do you know there's a problem when you can't see a problem?
Right.
It's like, how do you know there's a leak in the floor if you
If there's no
can't
water.
see, if there's no water? Right. It's like, it's draining,
Makes
it's
sense. Yeah.
draining somewhere, but
Right.
it's not visible. So you can't see it, you can't address it. So um I really, I'm not afraid to say I don't really know the answer to that question. I think it just goes
Neither do
back
I. Yeah.
to, some people are just really, really good at creating that facade. And, I think it's very obvious now at this point, with so many people in the news, whether they be, celebrities, or famous in some way, or influencers, or regular average people. We've got an epidemic. It is for sure an epidemic. It's everywhere. And I think you look at these people who have lives that you'd be like, oh my god, what in the hell could they possibly have going on in their life that would push them to to make that decision. But the bottom line is that, mental illness doesn't discriminate. It doesn't
No, it
matter
does
what your
not.
gender is, doesn't
Right.
matter, what your economic status is, doesn't
Right.
matter, how old you are, like none of it matters. And, I guess, we have to have each other's backs more. We have to teach this next generation to just to talk and to hold space. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. They work together. We have to
So true.
learn how to hold space for people, and people have to learn how to be open, learn that there are safe spaces out there, and you might have to do a little bit of work to find it. Like I'm incredibly fortunate as a human being. I have an unbelievable support system. My husband, my parents, my family, and I think back to when my oldest came out as bi. She's been out of college for a couple of years, but she was a junior in college. And it's funny, when she came out to us, I she told us after that it was really her kind of reconciling with the saying it out loud
Hmm.
part of it, and owning it and acknowledging it, like out in the real world. She was like, I wasn't worried about you guys. Like she's like, I knew you guys were going to be like, okay, great, now clean the shit off your floor. And
Yeah.
like, it's late, I got to go to bed, like that, like I love you. And and so, but a lot of people don't have that.
True.
And you know we need to be more empathetic as you know as as a people, as a
Right.
world. And
We also teach people
and
self-affirmation, just tell yourself
yes,
every day how much you love yourself and you accept yourself
yep,
unconditionally.
yep. And self-care, we need to keep pushing
Yeah.
self-care, because that piece of it just kind of goes right along with all the other parts that are so important, like that affirmation part. They all work hand in hand, like the communication part, like the the fitness part, the nutrition part, like all of it.
Oh yeah.
Learning how to say no, and not
Right.
allowing yourself to get to a point where you're underwater and you're super overwhelmed, and then you're like, well, shit, now what do I do? I'm drowning.
Yeah.
Boundaries, like all these things. You can pile all these different things that we need to do for ourselves, one on top of the other, but we have to make that mainstream, I think, is the bottom line.
I
All
agree.
of that
I agree
together.
100%. Hey, thanks
Yeah.
for sharing. What an
Yeah.
incredible,
Thanks for
incredible
receiving.
conversation.
Yeah. I feel like we could talk for 3 more days.
Yeah, we probably could.
No.
Do you have any type of a like resources or that you can send me over so I could put it on my website?
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely outlets and platforms where I get a lot of my own information from, like the National Alliance for Mental Illness,
Right.
and um, the um, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and again the Trevor Project. Um, and as I said, I'm working very feverishly on my own book, which, even though obviously it's an anecdotally based book, there will absolutely be resources in that. That's a little further off right now, and not something I have in my hands right now, but it will absolutely be packed with resources that people can leverage as they start and continue these conversations.
That's excellent. And I love your passion on this. That's what we need. We need more passionate people
Thank you, thank you.
coming
Well,
out
you
and
know
not
what?
being shy
It's
to talk about it.
yeah, because you know what? All it takes is one person sharing a story that prompts someone else, and then it's a beautiful domino effect, and then all of a sudden everyone feels like they can share their story. And so that's what we have to shoot for, because then
Yes,
then nothing is
absolutely.
off limits. Then we're all just supporting ourselves and each other.
And that's the beauty about my podcast, about this podcast,
Yes,
our podcast, because we're doing this together right now. Thank you so much for being a
that's right.
part of this show. Yeah, I'll be having the resources up on the website. Everybody, this is, oh, sorry about that. This is Lisa Sugarman. How can we find you, Lisa, on social media? Are you out and about on social media?
I am all over the place. I'm like a
Excellent.
nomad. You can find me in a
Yeah.
million different spots. You can find me on my website at lisasugarman.com. And you can find me on Twitter, the Lisa Sugarman. Instagram is Lisa_Sugarman. Facebook is the Lisa Sugarman. So, and my books are all over the place. They're, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all the good stuff, all the bookstores everywhere. So,
Lisa Sugarman,
yeah,
everybody. Thank you so much for being on A Little Less Your podcast. And I look forward to having you back on the show on LGBTQIA month.
thank you. I cannot wait.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Take care. Have a lovely day.
You too.